Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 141. Today we're talking Web Animations API. We are your hosts, Justin Robrell, Leon Rivel, and Amel Hussein. Leon, Amel, good to see you all. How's things?
Good, thank you.
Lovely.
And before we introduce our guest this week, I'm going to throw it over to This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thank you, Justin. So lots of new things this week. So first of all, we've got a minor version of TypeScript released, 2.5.3, which includes a long list of bug fixes. Angular 5 RC0 has been made available on GitHub. The TC39 string match proposal has been moved from stage 1 to stage 2, so check out the link in the show notes to find out what that's all about. React version 16 has been released with features such as the ability to return strings and arrays from render and improved error handling. And finally, Facebook is going to relicense projects to MIT, which previously had the BSD plus patents license, which has caused quite a bit of outrage in the open source community. And that's everything for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Interesting stuff. Yeah, the license thing. I feel like that comes up a lot these days every time anyone talks about, I'm going to use this in X. The WordPress folks really kind of brought that to light in that whole MIT patents license fiasco. So I'm glad to see it's changing. I like change.
What are we going to argue about now, Justin?
Shadow DOM.
Oh,
Shadow
I'm sure
DOM.
we'll find something. No, we're not. Not today. Today is not the Shadow DOM day. Though I believe that's coming up as Decorative Shadow DOM at the TPAC meeting soon. So, woohoo! I think that's on the list. I'm sorry. See, now I'm sidetracked again. But today we are talking about change. Today we're talking about change, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're talking about the Web Animations API. And we have one of the most lovely people to talk about that very thing. Rachel, welcome to the show. So good to see you again.
Hey, it's so good to be back. Thank you for having me.
You were on episode 23 of this show, which was like 3 years ago. It's been a while. Things have adapted and changed over the course of things. How have you been?
Been good. Moved up to Seattle, currently working at Microsoft, so I had some big changes of my own. I think the last time we talked, I was working on building interactive stories with HTML5, and then PWAs came along and totally made all that a reality after I stopped making interactive stories with HTML5.
Never fails, right? Technology eventually catches up.
I'm always about 3 or 5 years ahead of the curve. And I feel like, with the Web Animations API, I started getting into it 3 or 5 years ago. So it's like, it should be here now. It should be here now. It should be a thing now. In a way it is. It has become a thing since we last talked. And in another way, it hasn't gone nearly far enough to satisfy my insatiable appetite for the interactive web.
It seems to be moving, which I feel like is a bad pun when I say it that way, but admittedly, it's not quite as far along as I think we all hope. For those out there who don't know what the Web Animations API is, what, from a developer standpoint, why would a developer might care about it so much?
All right, good question. So the Web Animations API came about because way, way, way long ago, back in the long before times, there CSS animations and transitions just dropped in iOS Safari, and the WebKit team just kind of dumped those specs out into the open, which makes sense because nobody at the W3C had really gotten around to speccing out how to do animations and CSS animations and transitions. It was a big old game of chase your tail in circles. So WebKit was just like, we need these for the iPhone launch. Here you go. Prefix it if you want it, people, and peaced out. In the meantime, Smile had been around for at least a decade by then, and that's Smiles. It's an animations language for SVGs. Yes, it used to be the only thing you could animate with. The only thing you could animate without Flash was, aside from blink tags, was SVG. So, in the meantime, you saw browsers like Chrome and Firefox looking at implementing these, but the folks over at Internet Explorer, they said, oh my gosh, These are 3 different animation engines, and each one of them has, terrible specs on expected behavior. It'd be impossible to write tests for these things. Come on, you need an API. Give us an API that specifies all 3 of these animation engines. And they only implemented CSS animations and transitions and left Smile until the Web Animations API came about. It took a long time. It's a really big spec. And a lot of the features that were originally in it have been moved to a level 2. These are features that remind us of Flash, things like sequencing and grouping animations so that you can play several animations simultaneously or one after the other. Those have been moved to level 2. Right now, level 1, this is the change, I think, since the last time we talked. Right now, level 1 is sort of a minimal viable product for expressing CSS animations and transitions. Smile has been deprecated, so a lot of the Smile-esque features like shape morphs, etc., have been removed as well. So you might be thinking, Rachel, what is the point of having an API that lets us do stuff that we can do with CSS animations and transitions? I am glad you asked that, disembodied voice.
Of course, that's a great question. I mean, the voice came from down a pond.
You were reading my mind, Rachel.
Yeah. I just know immediately what all of our dear listeners is top of mind for them. Well, it does let us do some awesome things that are kind of a pain in the butt to use with CSS transitions and animations. You get promises and callbacks for like animation starts and ends, which the CSS listeners for those are kind of meh. There's also things like you can physically move the playhead around. So you can like play the animation in reverse or jump to a certain position in it. You could even like tie that playhead to scroll position for a parallax effect if you wanted. It's a little hacky. You have to listen for the scroll event and figure out exactly how far down the page a person is. But that does imitate one of the things that's been moved to level 2, which is scroll-based timings. It's pretty cool. So it lets us do some things that we can't do easily with CSS alone. And there's one thing that it does that we just wouldn't be able to do without it at all. And that is it literally opens up the browser's rendering engine to manipulation with JavaScript. This has allowed browsers to develop their own animation tools. For instance, Firefox has some of the best animation tools you can use right now. After I did the podcast with y'all 3 years ago, I did this great project with Firefox to celebrate their new animation tools called DevTools Challenger. You can go check it out at devtoolschallenger.com. And it's basically like this deep sea adventure that takes you on an odyssey where you learn how to use the browser's animation dev tools. So these sorts of things weren't possible before the Web Animations API. It's a first step in the right direction for really bringing animation into the open web community, as opposed to having it be largely the domain of JavaScript libraries or plugins.
Yep. Loads of amazing features in that particular API, but a lot of people still use CSS animations. So is there some situations where you just wouldn't use the Web Animations API?
When wouldn't I use it? Well, the Web Animations API, there are 2 kinds of ways of animating things. There's the animation where you know what your position A and position B should be, the declarative style of animation we're so familiar with from CSS. And the Web Animations API is very good at doing this. It's a very performant kind of animation. It's one of the ways that the API allows the browser to optimize all those animations, so you can get very performant animations using it. On the other hand, say you want a dynamic animation that can start, take, not just be a point A, but be a point B or C or, wherever, and then go to something completely different based on inputs, a more imperative model. This is better done with a JavaScript library like Greensock. And that is something where the Web Animations API does not excel today. So if you're doing more interactive type work, like some of the great sites you see on the Awwwards website, That's 3 Ws in Awwwards. They have a great gallery, but a lot of the sites in that gallery are very feature-rich, very interactive, and thus they tend to not use CSS animations or the Web Animations API. They tend to use advanced JavaScript libraries like Greensock or GSAP as we know it. I would say great place to use Web Animations API is any place where you could get away with CSS animations and performance matters, especially inside a user interface library. It makes so much sense. I know Angular 4's animation module runs out of the box on the Web Animations API, and it's just fantastic.
There is a bit of a disconnect, I think, when a lot of people start to hear about the Web Animations API. A lot of people don't think that it is particularly performant because they may have come from a land of time when folks were doing things in JavaScript that you don't necessarily want to do, things that would cause jank and whatnot. I hate to say it, but in some of those things of, hey, I can use these fancy jQuery plugin things that I once had, and look, I can move things around. But there is a huge gap between what that specification is at the low level and where we sort of came from. Because a lot of people, again, the spec was to some extent informed by things that magically landed from here upon high, from a sort of tagged thing that Safari came back. But animation on the web's been around a long time, and unfortunately, it's been hard to accomplish. I think, you mentioned Smile, and we've had Sarah Zerdane on before talking about, SVG and the sort of things. Developers didn't seem to take grandly to it. I mean, with Greensock, I feel like I see it a lot more now, which is nice because Greensock makes life particularly easier to do those more interactive things. Do developers understand animation? Like, is it one of those things that, from a code standpoint, it just looks too obtuse, or is it more along the lines of interaction design? And the reason I ask is because you've written a recent new book, Animation at Work, which I would like to plug at this point while talking about animations.
Oh, why, thank you so much. I should specify that my new book, out from a book apart, called Animation at Work, only available for purchase on the interwebs, and 10% off with the special coupon code just for your wonderful listeners, WebPlat, all caps, WebPlat, just one word. It just launched that August 22nd. But that book is more about where and when to use animation, less about how to implement it. And we can talk more about that a little later. If you want more hands-on how to actually code animations, you should check out my CSS transitions and animations course over at courses.rachelnabors.com. You can also use the same WebPlat coupon code there to get 10% off any course you want. All right, plugs aside, moving along. The thing about Greensock, the reason we're seeing it take off is actually a couple of numbers, a couple of things. Who here remembers jQuery?
It's a vague memory to me at this point, but I believe I recall it.
All right. So jQuery solved so many problems back in the day. I know we kind of rolled our eyes a little bit at it these days, now that everyone is like, you should be doing vanilla JS and some React. Yeah, that's how you get trained up now. But back in the day, jQuery came around because browsers could not agree on JavaScript specs. And jQuery just kind of made sure that it polyfilled that behavior across every browser ever. And it gave you this really easy syntax to just go out, get some things, and do things to them, right? Now, in the same way, Greensock is sort of the same way. It's one of the top 20 most popular JavaScript libraries on the web right now, which is very impressive considering that it wasn't too long ago, like when we last spoke, that it had just been translated over from its ActionScript original form. It used to be an ActionScript library, a tweening library for Flash, but ActionScript is a sister language to JavaScript. They're both dialects of ECMAScript. So when they saw that Flash was on the way out, the developers rewrote it in JavaScript and have been evangelizing it ever since. It's very easy for coding designers or design-oriented developers to pick it up. It goes out, it gets some things, and it animates them, right? That seems fair enough, but the Web Animations API does that too. It does it with less code even. So why would we use Greensock instead of this more performant Web Animations API that runs directly on the browser's rendering engine as opposed to, a request animation frame-based animations library like Greensock? Well, Greensock polyfills a lot of, inconsistent behavior between browsers, especially when it comes to SVGs. And SVGs are so hot right now. I mean, you had Sarah on, she was talking about Smile, and I'm sad to see Smile didn't take off more, but it's a little tricky to have so many animation libraries out there. I wouldn't be surprised if one day it came back in a different form. But for now, I think people are happy with Greensock. But Greensock, what it does is right now you can't really run CSS animations on some older browsers on individual SVG components like the G tag, etc. Because SVG is sort of its own little DOM within a DOM. And you got to map those attributes over to CSS properties. Long story short, you use Greensock, you don't have to worry about all that backwards compatibility. It just works. And it polyfills all that SVG behavior for you. It even has things like morph that we only had back in the Smile times. And it still offers grouping and sequencing, things that the Web Animations API hasn't offered yet, even though some developers have created libraries that polyfill that behavior. So, as you can see, it's very popular, sort of because it's fulfilling that kind of jQuery story arc. Right now, there are inconsistencies between browsers, and people just want to go out there, get some things, and animate them. Greensock is easy to spin up on. There are great courses available all over the place to get great tutorials on their site too, to get you up and running and creating performant animations and rich interactions for the world.
I've never used Greensock before and don't really know much about it, but it's probably not too far of a stretch to think that maybe they'll end up using the Web Animations API at some point in the future, given the performance, boosts of these type of animations. Does that sound like a thing?
I've spoken with the developers in the past on it, and the last I heard was they'll be interested in it once all the browsers get their SVG stuff together. So we're kind of otherwise they'd have to double the size of the code essentially. So I totally understand that they're holding off until this SVG thing is normalized across browsers, and I totally respect that decision.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of platform support, what browsers currently support the Web Animations API? To what extent?
Great question. So Firefox has the most complete implementation so far. It doesn't hurt that one of the Firefox developers is basically single-handedly writing the spec at this point. Brian Birtles, awesome person. Keep an eye on him. And then Chrome is following close on its heel. Web Animations plays well into their AMP and Polymer projects, as well as being the major heavyweight on the Angular library's animation module system. They also maintain its polyfill. And now you're thinking, okay, Chrome and Google, it makes sense. Firefox and Chrome tend to be on the forefront of everything. How about them mobile browsers, Rachel? What about iOS Safari? Well, the developer preview of iOS Safari has Web Animations API objects in it, no constructors. So it looks like the folks over at WebKit are experimenting or flirting with the idea of implementing it. I've got my fingers crossed on that one. And Edge still has it on its back burner. One day. But Internet Explorer will never have the Web Animations API.
I feel like we can say that for Internet Explorer about most things.
Well, it's effectively in maintenance mode right now.
Yeah, and that's probably for the best. It had a good run. It was a solid run, or some such. It is interesting you bring up the polyfill, though, because the polyfill's been kind of an interesting ride, because there was actually two variations of it, if I'm not mistaken. There was the initial polyfill, and then there was Web Animations Next, which...
Oh, you've been following.
Oh yeah, no. Admittedly, I've gotten to know the polyfill quite well lately. So.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, admittedly, you mentioned also that it had been in Polymer, and Neon, which had been recently deprecated in sort of the Polymer 2.0 sort of style of things as things have moved on, because, oh, look, you can use the web animation polyfill and just do that stuff yourself. Which made me say, oh, well, then I should go take a look at this polyfill. And then I was like, what is next? And interestingly enough, which is the difference? So there were initially two branches of that thing. And
Yes.
the branching being that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I have not quite grasped the entire history of it. The initial one was, hey, this is the current spec. And the next variation is we're going to add stuff on that we want to eventually be the spec. Things like grouping, things like tweening and whatnot. But lately, those repos have kind of combined into one thing, and now I legitimately don't really know where next sits in relation to the initial polyfill currently. Out of curiosity, do you happen to know?
I believe that, so it's been a little while since I looked at the Web Animations API polyfill, largely because this is my personal preference here. The polyfill is mostly maintained by the Chrome team. Well, people who work for Google. Maybe it's not the Chrome team, but people who work for Google. And it is, they're mostly testing on the various versions of Chrome that live on Android tablets and on your browser. And it's optimized for a Chrome experience. And typically when I'm using the polyfill, though, I am optimizing for a non-Chrome experience, like, somebody who's using iOS Safari, right? And so if it's not as performant on iOS Safari as it is on, say, an older version of Android's Chrome browser, that's a problem for me. So I have actually taken to basically, if Web Animations API exists, you get an animated experience. If it doesn't, I'm going to assume that your machine cannot handle the kinds of animations I'm going to dish at you, and I'm stepping you back to a jump cut interface. So basically, I just do a little feature detection and have shifted away from using the polyfill.
I have taken a similar approach. after some pain points.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So basically, you've opted to take the path of like a more progressive experience, right? So if your browser supports it, I'm going to do the full shebang, but I'm not going to bother creating a uniform experice, across browsers. Is that correct? I think that's great,
It is correct.
That's awesome, and I almost feel like it's easier for developers to kind of do that than have to maintain all these polyfills, and
And it's a complicated polyfill. It's not, look, animations are hard to do with JavaScript, and it's hard to create something like Greensock that covers every edge case. That is a product that people make. It's their job. And for the polyfill to cover all those edge cases, it practically have to be Greensock. So it's like, if I'm not, if I'm in that place where I want to use the Web Animations API, I also can assume that if your browser doesn't support the Web Animations API, it probably doesn't have the underpinnings to take full advantage of those performance boosts that the API delivers. So if the API doesn't exist, I can't trust that any animations I throw at the browser will be jank free. So I would rather just not use them, because a jump cut interface, an interface without animations, is much better than an interface that has janky animations.
Yeah, and the polyfill, I generally have some confusion around it. And again, it's one of those things that I want to like personally, like, 'cause, polyfills. But the point you make is very well taken. It is a very difficult polyfill to sort of sort out. I mean, once you start getting past some of the initial sort of keyframing effects that you may use that are sort of underpinned within CSS, once you get into things like additive, or you get into things like motion paths, Greensock to me things like Greensock seem to be a better option initially. Otherwise, feature detect and scale back exactly what you're delivering, which is also the approach I have taken of late.
I would say, like, the Web Animations API totally makes sense if you're developing for, like, the especially the Android ecosystem, because you've got some really solid support there from the development team working on the browsers and the projects there. It 100% makes sense. Even if you're developing for, a largely Firefox or Chrome crowd. But for everyone else, you might want to consider using CSS animations. And the interesting thing here is, Like Greensock is great. It's usually overkill for the kinds of user interface animations that you and I would do. Like we're not ad agencies. We're not creating interactive content. Greensock is a large library. It is a large animation JavaScript library, and it's a dependency. It uses request animation frames, so it's not necessarily jumping things off the main UI thread to do this, and it can be janky in certain situations. Unless you're doing something that requires that kind of heavy lifting to create an experience, as it were, you probably don't need more than CSS animations or the web animations API.
Oh, that's actually a really good point, too. Greensock, for me, personally, as just a dev out there building things, we have a tendency to use it for things that require quite a bit of interactivity, interactive books, that sort of thing, where you're trying to bring something to life that's right across the board. But when you start to talk about, I do see a lot of developers who use it for that overkill scenario where I want to, I should be using CSS or that sort of thing. And we've had, we just talked to Eric Myers the other day about this. Eric, Eric's been around the CSS world for, longer than many of us, I think, at this point. But do people, there is this mix, right, where how do I get all these things to sort of work together? Because I'm writing in JavaScript, but I kind of understand CSS, and I duplicate my CSS within this JavaScript. And then that gives me my, I'm going to get this wonderful keyframe effect that I'm going to do this thing against. Do developers grasp some of these things? It seems to me it's a hard thing to grasp for a lot of people who have just come onto it and were like, oh, wow, this is not particularly easy to do. I just can't tell it move X to Y, though realistically you can. And courses like yours have started to pop up and try to train people out. What are some of the common things you hear from developers as they kind of dive into this? Are they starting to address this sort of animation that they want within their application in a sort of sane manner?
I would say so. Animation over the past couple of years, I thought there was going to be this period of time where true story, there would need to be, web animation experts. And hello, I am a web animations consultant here to fix your web animations and train your people, etc. And there was a brief 2-hour moment where that was a thing. It wasn't 2 hours. It was a couple of years where that was a thing. And then boom, all of a sudden, every front end developer was like, yep, I have learned the CSS animations and the Greensocks, and I now know which one to choose. And I feel like a lot of developers who are working with animation, who work for places that value animation, which are still pretty rare, people are only just starting to come around to realize that, animation is a tool like any other tool in your tool chest for solving problems. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book Animation at Work. It's because a lot of the questions I'm actually getting from developers are, so I've got all these great designs and the client wants us to animate them, but I don't want to do the things that they're suggesting because they're stupid. Or they might say something like, we're building a really cool progressive web app. We want it to feel appy, but it just doesn't with all those, cut type interface. It doesn't feel like a native app. So I want to learn where I can add animations to make it have that look and feel that people come to expect from their iPad or their Android phone. So those are the kinds of questions I'm actually seeing. It's less how do I do this and more when do I do this. So there's this whole leapfrog, this great leap forward where everybody got trained up and now they want to know where they're supposed to do all this stuff. And animation is the new web typography in my mind. I think there was a point where I thought it was going to be a specialized thing a person could do. You could be a web animation specialist. I don't think so anymore. I think that's like saying I'm a web typography specialist. No one is a web typography specialist unless, they have a very strange niche job at Adobe that they cling to intently, because there's only 5 jobs like that in the world. A true story, these niche roles, there aren't a lot of them. And I think that web animation and animating on the web has now largely been distributed between design teams and development teams. And designers tend to come in and be like, how do I learn Greensock? Or I want to learn how to use Principle or Kite app, one of these motion design prototyping tools like After Effects. And you're seeing companies like Envision app adding animation tools into their prototyping workflows so that people can, prototype that so that designers can communicate to developers the things that they're seeing. Developers have been investing in the skills to implement those. And you've just kind of seen that the two groups have met in the middle. Did I answer that question right?
Yeah, no. I think you're spot on. It's interesting to me that there has been a meeting in the middle, because I remember when that was not so much the case, where you would get things in from basically After Effects, and they would say, "Let's build it like this," and you're sitting there going, "I cannot reasonably do this."
That still happens.
Still happens, sure. Do you see it as much as you used to? I don't see it as much as I used to. I feel like the tooling has gotten a little bit better, and that there's been a little bit, at least, maybe breaking of bread, some understanding of what the middle looks like. Though admittedly, I say that knowing what I got last week. So
I think that it has helped have this big focus on design systems. I worked on the Lightning design system motion portion back in the day when I was like, I'm a web animations expert. It was so much fun to work with the Salesforce people. They are awesome. They did a great job at building a modular design system that developers could use. And I think that as we're seeing people building design systems, they're remembering to document animations. And I don't just mean the touchy-feely, it should feel like this. I mean, like providing people with a tokenized timing system, or, these are the various micro animations that you're allowed to use. You can implement them together to create macro animations. So we're seeing this story coming together as people are working side by side on these things. In fact, just recently, Google Design created, well, I don't know that they created, but someone who worked at Google created an After Effects plugin that is an extension that lets you it basically spits out some JSON that a developer can plug into CSS or anything that they want. And there's also a tool, Bodymovin, which will export an entire After Effects file to SVG with JavaScript. And I know that the developer is really interested in the Web Animations API. He's a really cool guy. And Lottie, Airbnb's Lottie, which exports from After Effects to React Native, Android, iOS, even Windows, runs on top of Bodymovin. So the tooling is catching up with the needs. I know what it's like to stay up late and have like this GIF that you have to recreate with nothing but CSS and a toothpick. And that is not the case anymore. That is really primitive compared to what designers are capable of communicating now.
Yeah, I think we've moved up to Twig now from toothpick. I think that's...
So Rachel, I'm actually a little bit interested in the point that you brought up earlier. It seems like there's a lot of education around when to use animations, right? I mean, or there needs to be a little bit more education around when to use them, because they're very eye catching, right? We're like, and we're going to always be drawn to them instantly, and so if you over abuse it, you're not engaging your users. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk to the flip side of that around education around when to pull in these heavy libraries for developers, right? So how do people know when to use CSS animations versus using a heavier tool like Greensock, right? And is it really clear to most engineers like when you could just use CSS animations, or when you need something heavier, or when you need to tell your product people you need to go redesign this, right? It's not. As someone who is very afraid of CSS animations and animations in general, like I'm asking you this question.
Oh no, Emil, you've got to let me help you with that. You should never be afraid of CSS animations. They're your friends.
Oh gosh.
I'll get with you after the podcast and see if I can help you out there. But so rule of thumb is this an interaction that's state based? Is this a user interface interaction where you're touching something and something reacts to it? Very on or off, very linear, not involving any like swiping gestures or like moving an independent element across the screen with your fingertip, that sort of thing. If it's a state-based, more UI-based interaction, you can totally get away with using CSS animations for that. It'll be very performant too if you just stick to animating transforms and opacity. That said, if you're doing something more interactive, you're doing like extensive animations with SVGs, that's when you might start looking into a heavier library. That's where the weight of the library might pay off in speed of development time.
I mean, that makes sense. And do you know of any kind of rubrics or something that's rubric-like that's available to kind of help with making these decisions? Because I think people just automatically pull in libraries. It's just because as JavaScript developers, like the first thing we do is, what's available on NPM, right? So, this push towards using the platform, if no one's using it as often as they should be, it kind of also slows down progression there. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Okay. I got to ask you first, what's a rubric?
Oh, something like a matrix of like what you just explained. If it's this, do that, right? Like it's like a guide.
There should be. I think that sounds a lot like a flow chart. Essentially, what I just told you is all you need to know. I can't point you at any particular flow chart that will say that. Maybe I should actually draw one. Like, are you animating individual SVG components? Go to square 4. But typically, I think that would look like, it would basically look like most of the times use CSS3 wherever possible. And unless you're trying to do something that's very interactive, that involves determining where something is going to be based on a user input, in which case you should probably head over to GSAP Town.
No, that makes sense.
That's a great question. I should probably do that.
Well, it sounds like it could be. It's useful in kind of clarifying that for people, because most developers that are not doing this type of stuff day to day, when they have to do it, are really have nowhere to start. So.
Yeah, could there be a middle ground where the Web Animations API might kind of fit really nicely? So you've talked about the simple, more standard user interface animations that most web developers are familiar using CSS with, and then you've got the really fancy trick animations that we're talking about using kind of larger animation libraries. But I think there might be a middle ground where the Web Animations API kind of fits in really nicely. Like if you're building like a really kind of fancy mobile app based modal with nice entrance animations and maybe some fancy loading bars or other kind of more whiz-bang animations that using something like the Web Animations API, it's a lot easier to do that because you've got more control over when the animations start and stop and rewinding them, those kind of things. Do you think there's like a middle ground? Does that sound right?
That's the longer I work with the Web Animations API in level 1, the more I feel like you should just use CSS animations for the most coverage everywhere. But what the Web Animations API really shines at currently is if you're doing things that need to be rewound. But also, I think it's a bit more modular than CSS, especially if you're working in a more component, like a JavaScript-based framework. For instance, CSS animations come with a added bonus of they're sort of state-based. You put a class on something, and that is the class of its animation. Whenever that element has that class, it animates, right? And then you have an event listener, a CSS event listener, to do something when it's done. But that makes sense if you're just working with a flat HTML file. It can get a little, it's great because it handles state for you out of the box. But what happens when you're working on a system like Angular, where state is being handled by the system for you? Then doing class-based animations might make a little bit less sense. You might want to move all of your behavior into the JavaScript using the Web Animations API. And that's a case where what might typically be a CSS animation, where you're like, it's just, on or off. That's totally a CSS animation. It might be easier for you to implement that using the Web Animations API, and it might be more modular as well.
Yeah, I find CSS animations difficult. I kind of muddle through and get them done. But moving over to the Web Animations API, I've not used it for a very long time, but it just finally makes sense. It finally feels like I'm fighting a battle with a nice sharp sword as opposed to a blunt spoon. It's a much nicer experience. Yeah, for me anyway, it really is. So if anybody that's listening hasn't tried the Web Animations API out, I really recommend you do, because it might encourage you to write more cool animations for your web apps, definitely.
If you go to my site, rachelnabors.com/WAAPI, that's all lowercase, you can actually, there's a big old pile of resources there. Last year I documented the Web Animations API on a Mozilla grant over at MDN. So the documentation is really awesome and complete. It's got lots of good tutorials, great demos. You can find links out to all of that, including the spec and the polyfill at rachelnabors.com/WAAPI.
That's awesome. Thank you, Rachel. And so what's the polyfill story for people that are using Web Animations API? If we could just clarify that one more time. Like, so you can, what are other browsers? Do we need to actually like manually put in fallback, or is there a polyfill that we can rely on when it's done?
It's a drop-in polyfill. You go to the polyfill's GitHub page, you download its minified version, you put it on the page, and all of your web animation syntax JavaScript should just work.
Right, but it's not. They're not going to be more performant, right? Or they're not going to be as performant when on older browsers. Is that correct?
As performant as
what? You're not tying directly into the rendering engine, for example.
No,
right?
You won't get those wonderful boosts that you're going to get in a more modern browser. But I suppose you could say that's like the meaning of progressive enhancement.
Okay, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, that polyfill follows the guide of most polyfills, where it's going to work ideally, but you're not going to get the perf bump. Polyfills are hard. Like they are difficult engineering problems, and I think people have a tendency to forget this. A lot of the polyfills are written by people who are working on the spec or working on browser engines themselves, and I always want to give a shout out to the polyfill authors, because that is a terribly difficult job to do when you do not have things that where the past was just like, I don't believe in this particular topic. We decided not to implement this thing, but we're going to recreate it.
Yes, I remember the poor polyfill team has just been chasing after the API team, because the API has changed a little bit, sometimes because of my input from the animation community, and the polyfill team has had to make changes that the more recent version of the polyfill might not necessarily work with old versions of the Web Animations API syntax. So I do not envy them that job.
No, I think if you're out there and you're thinking to yourself, how can I contribute? Candy, flowers, that sort of thing. Anything's nice to make a polyfill engineer's day better.
Yeah, a thank you is always appreciated. So if you do use the polyfill, I highly it's all on GitHub. I highly recommend that you participate in the discussions there and give them feedback so that they can do an even better job. We're going to have the polyfill for quite some time, so give them some love.
Oh, that's awesome. And so, Rachel, just to tie some points back home with this, so can you give us a couple of examples of things that developers would have to, do in a more verbose way that they can now do, more elegantly with the Web API, with the Web Animations API?
Oh my God! Well, just changing something from point A to point B, it requires. Darn it! I'm sorry, I can't describe it in language. I'm not that I haven't used Greensock in so long because I've just been doing everything in the Web Animations API. But simply changing, something's color from one thing to the other can be done in like one line of Web Animations API code. Whereas with Greensock, you have to load the library and you have to set quite a bit more in space and in place, and it gets a little bit more complicated. And you'll find that the Web Animations API is pound for pound much lighter. Anyway, I would say if you want to have conversations about the Web Animations API, like kick the tires and check it out and feed back into the spec and talk to the spec author, you should check out the Animation at Work Slack channel, which has been running for like 2 years now. It's a great community. We got people of all different kinds of progressions. We've got people who work with the Web Animations API, CSS. We've got people who work with more prototype end tools. We even have Greensock folks representing there, and we got channels for all of them. But specifically, we have a Web Animations API channel, WAAPI, of course. And if you go there, you can talk with people who are working on the spec itself and give feedback and let them know how it's going.
Feedback is always appreciated. No opinion is generally a bad opinion, unless it's on Shadow DOM, in which case, again, Leon, we're not talking about that today.
You want to.
I always want to. The reality is that as developers, there's a lot of say that developers have these days, whereas and you've probably experienced this yourself, Rachel, where beforehand it was kind of hard to get involved initially, right? If you wanted to, sort of contribute and say, this case doesn't really work for me. Like I use it in these sort of cases. Developer feedback really is kind of growing in terms of informing the way that specifications and the features that come to the web are sort of developed out now these days.
It's true. I love the dialogue that browser vendors and specs communities like the W3C are having with the community. Something I've noticed from working on the other side of the community on browsers is that developers are sort of, well, you might not realize it. Like we all kind of like, oh, wow, the latest version of Firefox or Chrome is here. I'm so excited. Look at all these new APIs. And you feel sort of like it's a gift that you're being given. And I love that feeling. But also at the same time, you're the number one customer of these browsers because you're building all the content that people use those browsers to go look at. And so on the other side of the fence, there's this great feeling of respect and appreciation as well from the people who build these browsers and write the specs. And there's definitely a love of the dialogue that we as a community have with the people building out these things that we do our work in.
So in terms of the things that are sort of being worked on today, what is your pie in the sky vision for it? Like, what's the thing that's missing within sort of animations today, or things that you see that you're just like, man, I hope that thing is coming soon. Like the thing that just you as a developer are going, you know what? This is the thing that's going to make my day. That's going to be second edition of my book. That's the next thing. Whoa.
I'm smiling so wide right now. There are a couple of things I got my eyes on right now. Some of them are in development and some of them aren't. Number one, WebKit introduced a reduced motion media query so that people who do not like animation or perhaps see animations make them sick, if they set their system-wide preference, in the accessibility controls in your iOS system to reduce motion, anything you put in that media query will, show or not show, depending. So this is a great way to allow people to have control over their user experience. Maybe they just don't want to spend energy on animations in their in their browser. Maybe that could be tied into a low energy setting as well. I don't know, but I think it's great, and it's definitely a missing piece of the puzzle. Another thing that would actually personally I would totally be benefited from. Complex timing functions. Right now, all we got are cubic Bezier curves, and they're kind of primitive for the sorts of springs and scroll-based animations that people want to do, that I want to do. So I would like to see a complex timing function rear its head in the future. And then I suppose one thing I am excited about is Houdini. It's got it's this new CSS spec. We don't have time to get into it here, but check it out. It's got a paint and an animation worklet, which might make some of these things possible without waiting for browsers to implement them.
Yeah, Houdini is looking pretty trick. I too am really excited for Houdini, and we've talked about it. I think we've talked about Houdini. Sort of, it seems to come up a lot on the show now. I think everyone's really excited about the notion of going, oh, I can add some of my own primitives on here, and it'll be nice.
I'm really interested to see if it will take off. I know it's a big gamble of Chrome's, but I think that the people who've been thinking about it have been putting a lot of very good, thoughtful process behind the different solutions that are on offer here. So I'm really interested to see how this turns out.
Yeah, extensible web and extensible CSS, that's like super exciting, and so it's kind of the perfect name too. It is really magical. I remember Surma, like I first heard about Houdini, I think a couple of IOs ago. Surma gave this awesome talk on it, which we can link in the show notes, but it's pretty cool.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so with that said, any last words of wisdom that you want to part us with? Before we end the show, is there anything that we missed that you wanted to say?
Oh my gosh. Way to put me on the spot there, Mel. It's I don't know. Hang on.
Well,
give me a minute.
Well, you actually you said something which I'm gonna now quote moving forward, and I will share on Twitter. But animation is the new web typography. I really like that. That was a pretty wise little thing to say.
Well, it is a skill. It's expected that you should be able to talk this. Web animation, well, animation period, is it's gone from being a delighter, quote unquote, to an expected. Sort of like you wouldn't buy a phone that doesn't have an LCD screen, right? We've all come to expect that a phone will have a touch-based screen on it. You can't sell a candy bar phone anymore. But when that phone first came out, that screen was so amazing and everyone was delighted, and everyone had to have one. I think it's the same way with animation. When it first came out on the web, everyone was really excited. I mean, even back in the Flash era, and then again with CSS animations and Greensock, and everyone wants to use it. But now it's sort of expected. It's an expected experience of modern web development and design. It's 100% expected when it comes to touch-based native apps. And as we're seeing as we're seeing the web move into the apps world, as we're seeing the proliferation of progressive web apps and their ilk, animation is becoming a necessary tool in web development's tool chest. If you want to keep up to date, I'm going to say you should totally check out my newsletter at webanimationweekly.com.
Awesome. That's a super profound ending. Thank you. So where can people find you on the internet besides your website? I think rachelnabors.com, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty much anywhere Rachel Nabors is, including on Twitter. I tweet most at Twitter, and I'm also increasing my animation blogging over at animationnetwork.com.
Fantastic. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with us today.
Thank you all for having me. It's so good to be able to come back and talk to you and catch up on how things have changed and how interaction and animation have moved forward on the web in the past couple of years.
Well, I hope you'll come back and we can talk more about Houdini and all kinds of interesting things.
I would love that. In the meantime, keep rocking on with your bad selves. Love the podcast.
Thank you so much. Amel, Leon, it's time to wrap up. Any parting words this week before we go off into the web sunset and write some more code?
I'm a lot less afraid of animations now. Rachel has made them sound really cool and very fetch, No pun intended. So, yeah.
From me, just if you've not checked out the Web Animations API yet, you totally should do.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been, I believe, another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 141. We've broken into the 140s, ladies and gentlemen, on the Web Animations API. We have been your hosts, Justin Rebrell, Leon Revel, Amel Hussein, and our guest this week was Rachel Nabors, which we'll put on all the show notes. We hope to see you next week where we talk more things about the web. Have a good rest of your week.